How important is it that the Cardinals make a trade, sending Nolan Arenado anywhere else before spring training camp begins? One MLB Network host feels that it's of the utmost importance for the Cardinals, and with recent rumors reignited about the Cardinals potentially moving Arenado to Boston, we'll talk about the impact that him still being with the team could potentially have if the Cardinals aren't able to find a deal. What's going on, everyone, and welcome into this edition of B-Schaeff Daily. Brenden Schaeffer with you. It is Wednesday, February 5th, 2025. So it was Matt Vasgersian. I saw this clip on Twitter earlier today, posted by MLB Network, where Harold Reynolds and Matt Vasgersian are talking about the recent rumors, however you want to classify it, that the Cardinals and Red Sox have had more recent trade conversations surrounding Nolan Arenado. John Morosi tweets out a lot of these types of things, and I saw some criticism of his tweet where basically people said, look, this could have been posted at any point throughout the offseason, and it has a chance of being true. But the tweet goes as follows. The Red Sox and Cardinals have had recent communication about Nolan Arenado. Source says, if the trade talks move forward, they could have implications for Alex Bregman's market. Of note, Cardinals exec Chaim Bloom has close knowledge of Boston's prospects. Of course, we know that because Chaim Bloom came from Boston. He was fired there as their head baseball executive, but then the Cardinals scooped him up a little bit later. And, of course, he is the Pobo in waiting for John Mozeliak, working behind the scenes still this season in 2025, but it's going to be his show next year. So if you're going to make a trade of Arenado, it would make sense to use Chaim Bloom as a pretty critical resource in terms of what you might be able to get back in return. But as we know, the main aspect of the Arenado thing, it's really twofold. The Cardinals are looking to shed some salary, but additionally, the second aspect of this is they're trying to clear a path. They want to clear a path for their younger players. And there's been some criticism over the fact that they haven't done anything this offseason. So can you really say you're resetting, retooling, etc., if the roster is basically the same as it was last year, save for a few of the free agents that departed? You just didn't make an effort to re-sign them. So in theory, you can have some younger players taking those guys' spots. But otherwise, there just hasn't been a lot of movement to really clear a path. And Nolan Gorman's one of the key names that we're talking about because he's a guy that, if you look at last year, he was in AAA for a good chunk of the season, being blocked by his own underperformance, for one, because the Cardinals were still of a mindset that they were trying day in, day out to contend and see if they couldn't sneak into the playoffs. They fell short. But this year, we know that it's going to be a different set of circumstances. The Cardinals are going to give Nolan Gorman the run. They're going to give Jordan Walker the run, right? They're not going to say, we don't trust his defense. He can't be in the lineup today. We don't trust what the matchup might be. He can't be in the lineup today. Oh, that happens for long enough. Maybe he should be down in AAA getting everyday work. No. The everyday work is coming in the big leagues. It's going to be sink or swim with some of those younger players. But it's hard to do that in full if you don't trade Nolan Arenado. So, that would be the implication. And I think that's why in this conversation between Harold Reynolds and Matt Vasgersian on MLB Network, Matt Vasgersian's takeaway is they got to get this done before spring training begins. And so we'll play that from Matt Vasgersian and MLB Network in a moment. But before we get to that, I want to take a moment to tell you all about Underdog Fantasy. Underdog is the place to play if you're a fan looking to cash in on all your favorite athletes' performances. And with the big game coming up on Sunday, Underdog is truly taking it to the next level when it comes to the promotions they're offering to their users. Underdog is celebrating the big game by giving everyone a no-sweat entry, which means you either cash in or you get your entry fee back in bonus credit. I've already locked mine in on Underdog Fantasy. It includes Dallas Goedert going for a huge number of receptions because I think he's going to be able to be a key part of that for the Philadelphia Eagles attack. So I went higher than 7.5 receptions for Goedert in my entry, which is kind of fun because it really juices up the potential winnings there because it's considered a scorcher multiplier. And I paired that up with Juju Smith-Schuster higher than 24.5 receiving yards because he had a big role in the AFC Championship game. Come join Underdog before the big game kicks off by signing up with promo code b-schaeff to get up to $1,000 in bonus cash instantly when you make your first deposit. And a free pick. That's right, you get a free pick. Travis Kelce, higher than a half a yard in the big game. That's the free pick being offered to new users. So sign up with that promo code b-schaeff right there on your YouTube screen or check the video description below for the sign-up link. Underdog Fantasy, a great way to enjoy the big game. It is definitely what I will be doing between the Chiefs and Eagles on Sunday afternoon. But let's get into some more Cardinals conversation because what Matt Vasgersian had to say here is, I think, sentiment that a lot of Cardinals fans share, which isn't to say they don't love Nolan Arenado, but it's just, I think, what the situation has devolved into, and when you consider the goals of the team for this year, it's probably better for all involved if they're able to move Arenado before spring training begins, which is like a week away. I'm driving down to Jupiter the day after the big game and getting ready to go into full baseball mode at that point. So here's Matt Vasgersian from MLB Network, a tweet that they posted earlier on Wednesday.
The one thing, when you start hearing players say, I'll move to first base to get out of here. That's what he said about going to San Diego. Yeah. Let me out. I'll play first base. Yeah. I know they got Manny. I'll move to first. A Hall of Fame worthy Gold Glove third baseman saying, I'll move to first.
Yeah.
That's how bad it is.
I really thought that if there was a trade for Arenado, it would be to one of the 3 Southern California teams, being a SoCal native and knowing where he'd like to play. But this makes a lot of sense, too. And I agree with you completely. You can't open camp with him there. You make a move. I mean, neither party seems satisfied with the relationship at this point. So we'll see how that plays out.
And Fenway Park is perfect for him.
So there's a little of a national perspective on everything going on surrounding the Cardinals and Nolan Arenado's, soured relationship. I guess you could say that certainly seems to be the thoughts of the MLB Network desk. And look, I think some aspects of what Harold Reynolds was saying about, and we've talked about this on the podcast too, about Arenado basically saying or leaking out, or his agent telling somebody, however it ended up getting reported, right, throughout the grapevine there, that he would move to first base in order to facilitate a trade. That was a lot earlier in the offseason, kind of laying the foundation and the groundwork for potentially a few of the various teams, like San Diego, potentially, like maybe even Boston, depending on what they want to do with Devers, like several of those clubs, to basically say, hey, don't forget about me. You could come after me and I could join your team. Even if you feel like you have your third base situation all settled, I'd still love to come play and be a part of a contender. That was the way that was framed early in the offseason. And it paints a picture of desperation for Nolan Arenado to get out of town, right? And I agree with a lot of that sentiment. Like, if this dude, he's as good as anybody over the past decade defensively at third base, and he's willing to change positions just to get out of St. Louis, seems like he really wants to go. Begs the question, why didn't he accept the trade? When there was one sitting on the table, he could have gone to Houston, which, as Harold Reynolds says there, Boston, Fenway Park, great place for him when you've got the green monster that you can whack doubles off of or hit homers over throughout the next few years of your career. Would have been a similar situation when you think about the ballpark in Houston and the Crawford boxes, being able to juice up your numbers that way for Arenado, who's somebody who has felt like the ballpark at Busch Stadium has hindered his numbers. Would make a lot of sense to maybe go to a home ballpark where you can use that pull-happy style of hitting that has made Arenado so good over the years and use it to your advantage. But decline the trade to Houston. Okay, so whatever you thought about his desperation to get out of St. Louis at the time, he either wasn't that desperate or misplayed his hand drastically, just completely bungled it, thinking that there would be something else to come along. And maybe there will be. Maybe he was willing to wait this out and say, I'm not going to settle for an okay result, because I think a great result is coming just around the corner. We will see if that ends up being the case. But if you hear Matt Vasgersian, he thinks, Arenado's probably got the leverage where the Cardinals just need him gone. The Cardinals just need to get through this offseason, get rid of him, and then come into camp without him being part of the equation, because there's just too much awkwardness there. There's too much, that has happened, that has been said. When you publicly say we want to trade a player, that usually is the end of the line with that player, which is why when Mozeliak said that at the, whether it was the winter meetings or the GM meetings where he made that comment publicly, that was the point at which I said Arenado's not going to be on this team, because it felt a lot like when they said it about Tyler O'Neill. The difference, though, is the no-trade clause that Arenado possesses, and the fact that the Cardinals, they didn't care what they were getting for O'Neill. They were just getting him out of here. And I think both of the pitchers they got are no longer with the organization. Nick Robertson, I believe, was taken off the 40-man, and Victor Santos, I believe, same deal was released. So this is a little bit of a different situation, because there's the contract that they're trying to get rid of the money, and that's going to give the other team some leverage. Arenado's got the leverage of being able to say no to a trade. He's already exercised that leverage. He wouldn't do it again, I don't think, when it comes to Boston. He said, or has had it put out there, that he would happily go to Boston. But Boston's been kind of waiting around when you think about the Bregman market. We've talked about the reasons that it would be easier for a team to go in on Bregman than Arenado, because there are fewer complications. It's just the money. But maybe there aren't fewer complications. Maybe Bregman himself is a complicated guy, and teams aren't finding that they're able to land on common ground with him. And maybe Boston gets tired of waiting and says, well, we know the Cardinals are looking to move their third baseman. Let's go ahead and make that happen rather than chase this Bregman thing down. So that's the new rumor/report. I say rumor/report because Morosi puts it out there. But again, it's not anything new, right? We know the Bregman thing is hanging out there. We know that the Cardinals are trying to move Arenado. If there's been additional conversations with the Red Sox and the Cardinals this week, I guess that's notable. But, until we see anything come to fruition, it's really hard to speculate as to like how legitimate that report is, because sure, there are probably conversations that go on all the time. We talk about this a lot in contextualizing the reports, especially around the trade deadline or the hot stove that will come out. And always you have to look and see, well, who's saying it, who's reporting it, and decide which reporters you trust and which you say, okay, interesting, but I'm maybe going to take that with a grain of salt. It's easy to say that there have been recent communication. I'm not saying that Morosi's wrong, but the extent of it, how deep were these talks? Was it simply Cardinals throwing a text in the Boston direction or vice versa, and there wasn't anything like substantial new that moved the talks forward in a meaningful way? Or were there some traction, behind this? That is what we don't know based on a tweet like that. It's easy to say, oh, yeah, there have been some conversations because, all right, think functionally. How does that come to be? How does somebody end up reporting that? Well, I mean, maybe John Morosi is having a conversation, whether it's with an agent or whatever the team exec that's a source for him, and asks. Maybe he reaches out and says, hey, have there been, you guys still talking with the Cardinals, or vice versa? Cardinals usually don't leak anything, so I wouldn't expect it would be from their side. Maybe it's just simply asking Arenado's agent, like, is you talking with any teams? What about the Red Sox? That seems like a fit. People are talking about the Red Sox, and the agent can say, yeah, they're still kind of kicking it around. Okay, then you can tweet that out and say, well, there have been recent communication. That's true. But what does it mean? I think, and I don't know in this instance what it is for Morosi's source, but I'm just pointing out that it could mean anything on the scale. There's a pretty wide variance and a vast array when you talk about the gradient, if you will, of meaningful communication versus it's more of the same, but they're just continuing to check in because they want it. They know that once this Bregman thing happens, that's where it really could pick up for Arenado or whatever the conversation is. So. Not doubting that that's happening. It's just one of those things that we've kind of been able to peg throughout the offseason. And if both sides aren't doing their due diligence, at least keeping in communication, then they're probably doing it wrong. But again, we've talked about what the impact would be. And let me know, too, if you agree. Like, do the Cardinals need to, and it's obviously been their priority, but how far should they be willing to go to get him off the team before spring training so that you don't have to deal with the distraction of him being in camp? And it's unfortunate that it seems to be coming to this point, but it could be coming to that point. For the Cardinals and their stance on it, obviously we haven't heard from Arenado, but Mozeliak said at the winter warm-up that no, he doesn't think there would be any problem from like a personal standpoint. If Arenado's on the team, he'll come and he'll be, a model citizen. They don't have any concerns about that. And I really honestly don't either. I think it might be getting overblown a little bit on that MLB Network side because what's going to happen? Arenado's going to come. He's going to show up. All of us writers and media folks are going to say, hey, can we talk? And he's either going to say, yeah, because maybe he's got something to say, or he's going to say no, and we'll all tweet out, yeah, Arenado didn't want to talk. And people are going to say, oh, my gosh. But functionally, what does it do? Nothing. Dude's going to go about his work. He's going to go about trying to get better, going about preparing for the season, or he's going to talk, and we're going to share what he says, and then he's going to prepare for the season, same as always. That's going to be going on in the background, but it's not something that I think is going to necessarily be just this bombshell at camp. People are going to want to hear from him for sure if he's there. But it's still something that if a trade happens during camp, it'll happen, and then that'll be the point at which the Cardinals move forward. But otherwise, I just don't think, and I think everybody's adult about it. I think the teammates of Arenado understand the business side of it. Guys that we spoke to at winter warm-up said they would love to have him, have him still be a part of the team. But we'll see. Time is going to tell as it pertains to that. But again, with the aspect of how does it impact the Cardinals, I want to talk today about the bench because we chatted about the bullpen a week ago or so. What's the bench outlook for the Cardinals right now, and how does that change? How is that impacted by Arenado? Because the Cardinals are one of maybe one or two teams that have not done anything this offseason. I think the Guardians, I haven't seen if they've signed a free agent or they've made any substantial moves. The Twins just did. So it's been very few teams that have been completely inactive to the degree that the Cardinals have been completely inactive so far. So we can continue to talk about will the Cardinals add anything, and it seems like they might do something minor. but that this Arenado thing is really the roadblock keeping them from spending any money. So with that in mind, it sort of would stand to reason that we should look at the roster as it stands and figure out, okay, where would you find another bench spot? Where would you, who kind of fills the role of that last spot on the bench if Arenado ends up moving? Because right now, here's the way I have it breaking down. We can kind of talk through this together. This is how I've listed things out, and I'm going to do it without Arenado around. Because with him around, it's obviously one less spot, and Gorman sort of either slides to the bench or a DH spot, but they don't want him to be an everyday DH because they've got to utilize that first base and catcher platoon situation to house a DH, I think, on a pretty regular basis. Because here's how I see it playing out. Pedro Pagés I've written down as the catcher. I know Herrera's around. I'll get to him in a minute. Contreras at first, Donovan at second, Gorman at third. You can swap those two if you want. The scuttlebutt has been that the Cardinals want Gorman to play third base, which is what he came up doing, moved to second, and then they think, okay, third's going to be the fit. If that's the case, fine. Gorman at third. Wynn at short, Nootbaar at left field, Ciani in center with a note for Victor Scott the second because I think he's going to be gunning for a job coming into camp. So that'll be an interesting competition. Walker is in right field every day. Ivan Herrera I've listed as the DH because I think Ivan's going to play a lot. The name I didn't list so far that's going to play a lot too is Burleson. So as we start to carve out the bench, because it'll be some days Ivan Herrera will be catching and Pagés will be on the bench. Burleson would be a DH or, sliding into an outfield spot on those days. But kind of carving out the way the bench could look, Burleson is a regular. He's going to be a pretty common name in there, but so is Pagés, so is Herrera, so is Contreras, so is Gorman. Like, these guys are all going to mix and match depending on their version. Because like a guy like Donovan, the versatility that he brings defensively can allow you to do some different things as well. Maybe they play some Nootbaar in center. Like, that would be an obvious way to be able to beef up the offense. If you put Burleson in left, Nootbaar in center, Walker in right. But they like Ciani. They're going to give Victor a chance here in spring to show what he can do. So it's going to be that trade-off of offense for defense, depending on what the team thinks it needs on a regular basis. I do kind of get the sense that only one of Ciani and Victor Scott would probably make the team unless Victor just forces the issue. And, of course, there are injuries. Remember, at this point in the calendar, I shouldn't say this point, whatever point that Brandon Crawford signed last year, that was when we were all looking at the roster going, there's really no spot for Burleson, even on the bench. He's going to start in Memphis. And then what happened? A bunch of guys get hurt. It's a revolving door. Burleson's an everyday regular player. So don't freak out that I'm not necessarily pegging Burleson into the lineup. He's going to be there a lot. He's probably going to be batting in the top third of that lineup, especially against right-handed pitchers with frequency. But just the way I break it down, I wanted to put Pagés at catcher to show that I think he's going to play a lot. Herrera, DH, Burleson will be in that mix. That's 10 position players. You've got 13. It thins out rather quickly without Arenado, which is fine because they're trying to get the spot for Gorman. But I wanted to at least kind of say, well, here's what you would end up having in terms of maybe a competition or a predetermined way by the Cardinals of how they want to use those bench spots. I'm going to list the guys that are on the 40-man and talk about their relevance to the roster. Luke and Baker. We'll start with the infield. We're filling 3 spots, and remember, none of them have to be a catcher because I've already kind of couched Pagés and Ivan Herrera into the everyday lineup. So none of these 4 bench spots have to be a catcher. One of them we're going to say is Burleson, and if it helps you mentally to swap that out and say it's Pagés and Herrera's your catcher and Burleson's your DH, fine. It doesn't really make any difference. We're just finding the 13. And again, we're doing this without Arenado. Luke and Baker, I don't think is a lock to make the roster, but I think his role, like he should be, as long as he has a requisite spring, in a great shape to make the roster because I think there's value to what he could bring off the bench. When you look at the way that your lineup shakes out, the lefties in your lineup include Donovan, Gorman, Nootbaar, and both Ciani and Victor Scott as left-handers. So there are going to be opportunities, and Burleson as well is worth mentioning in that conversation too. So there are going to be opportunities, I think, where lineup was stocked with lefties. Lefty reliever comes in, tough name, and good at-bat spot for Luke and Baker, who learned a lot last year in that role. Said coming up the year before that, he really didn't have the comfort with coming off the bench at the big league level because it just wasn't something he ever did. You kind of have to learn that role. And then last year he got some more opportunities to do it and said, I felt a lot different. I felt a lot more comfortable. And based on the number of lefties that are going to be involved in the lineup, I see a value to having a guy like that who doesn't really need to play a position. I don't care what position he plays. He'll play first base, whatever. Comes off the bench, takes the tough at-bat as a righty when you face tough lefty relievers. Legit bat that I think could fulfill that role and be an actual threat off the bench. Last year, you didn't have any real threats off the bench in the way that it played out, right? So this year's bench, can it look a little bit different? I think Baker can be certainly a part of that. And then positionally, I'm not too concerned about what it looks like. Beyond that, what do you need positionally on your bench? We've got 2 spots left. We put Burleson and Baker in there. We know both catchers are around. Burleson is a 4th outfielder. Donovan is a guy that could also play outfield, 5th outfielder. So depending on what, I think it's less about need and more about who do you have and what do you want to do with those players. Because if you have a guy that can play a variety of infield spots, that's fine to have on your bench, because if push comes to shove and you have to move somebody to the outfield like Donovan, you can do that, and then the infielder can kind of slide in and take that spot. Thomas Saggese is on the 40-man, and he's an obvious fit to kind of in this description of, a guy that could play second, a guy that could play third, a guy that's been improving and getting more time in at short. So he's a true utility guy across the infield. Right-handed bat, so just keeping that in mind. Right now, we've already kind of considered that one of the left-handed bats involved here is Burleson from our bench, but we've got a bunch of guys in the lineup that are lefties too. So I don't think that we're unbalanced if we don't specifically have another lefty off the bench necessarily. Although I think there would be a way to get one if you decide that you're not as keen on putting Saggese in your, and maybe you do it with Saggese as well. The thing with Saggese is, do they have the playing time for him to justify putting him on the team out of spring? And again, this is on paper with nobody injured. One infielder goes down, and that math suddenly changes quite a bit in his favor, because he could start at second, could start at third, heaven forbid, could start at short if he had to, maybe. I don't know about that. Let's just hope Mason win. We don't have to talk about that as far as an injury goes. But I think if there was an infielder that went down, you wouldn't have to squint too hard to see how Saggese gets regular playing time in the big leagues. And again, this is in the world where Arenado is not on the team. So I think that is just a decision they've got to make. Is he a guy where they say, no, he needs everyday playing time, and unless there's an injury, he's probably not making the team? Is he outperforming Nolan Gorman, and they say he's making the team and getting Gorman's at bats, and we're pivoting because Gorman just has a horrendous spring? Like, that would be a pretty short leash if that's the way that they go. But are they in the development business? Yes. Are they in the business of, let's find out what team we are and play the best guys? They might be in that business too. That would be a very interesting push comes to shove type of deal if a bad spring would allow them to, or be enough to kind of push them in a direction on how they view Gorman. I think not. But again, I mean, if it was really like he was batting .091 with 50% strikeout rate, what would happen? I don't know. Hopefully they don't find that out either. But anyway, as we're looking at a couple of these bench spots, Saggese is a really interesting one. I'd love to see him on the team. I also would understand if they're like, yeah, he's not really going to get enough playing time to justify it. Especially if Arenado's here, the path gets even tougher. If they trade him, maybe Saggese is that guy where you say, yeah, off the bench, he can play all the positions, and we feel good about that. A little bit of a lesser version, but one that might make more sense for the bench because of the fact that I think internally he's not viewed as a future MLB starter, is Jose Fermin, who, yes, is still on the 40-man and could play those infield positions. They've never trusted him to play shortstop in the big leagues, but he came up as a shortstop and has, said it winter warm-up. I'm perfectly content and happy to do it. They've also been pushing him more into the outfield, trying to get him looks out there, and that was a topic of conversation last summer. The bat has never shown at the big league level for Fermin to be one that you project to turn into much of anything, but he had a really strong season last year in AAA. So, they had 924 OPS in Memphis last year, didn't translate in St. Louis, had a 438 OPS with the Cardinals in 79 plate appearances. But he's somebody that could play some different infield positions, could play outfield too. So if you're talking about just not wanting to block Thomas Saggese from playing time, Fermin's spot makes a whole lot more sense as another guy on that bench. And then you're getting into, okay, how do you find Maybe another lefty on the bench if you think you need it. Again, with Baker, with either Fermin or Sajaci, you feel pretty good about having some righties, positional flexibility with Fermin, Burleson with some corner outfield and first base positional flexibility. Probably still would like to have somebody that you're comfortable with the shortstop thing. If it's not Sajaci, maybe that's, they've signed some guys to minor league contracts with invites to spring. Maybe that ends up turning into something. I think the former Reds prospect that was a shortstop, is somebody that'll be at camp, and maybe it's a non-40-man guy that ends up kind of sneaking his way onto the bench. But if you're just looking at the guys that are on the 40-man roster, the name that I think is interesting, who actually positionally might have a nice fit, if the Cardinals think, no, we want Donovan to be more of an infielder this year. We didn't have the luxury to do that last year, and so he's going to kind of just be the regular second baseman. If Gorman's going to be the regular third baseman, maybe less of a utility slant to Donovan's role. If that's the case, left-handed hitting outfielder who could play all three positions could be as simple as Matt Koperniak. Matt Koperniak is on the 40-man roster. He's somebody we talked about last year a little bit, but he was basically didn't fit because the Cardinals had guys like Crawford and Carpenter on the bench, batting lefty. Now you could maybe see the utility for another lefty off your bench. The problem is he's an outfielder, and Nootbaar's a lefty as well. Burleson's a lefty as well, and your center fielders are left-handed. So you'd still be pretty left-handed hitting heavy again in the outfield, but Walker playing every day and right and not being a guy who you think about as part of the bench mix would at least balance you out a little bit more as far as left-right within your everyday lineup. And it could be one of those cases where, Koperniak comes in for defense late for Jordan Walker. And this is in the mind where they don't really view Victor Scott as somebody, kind of like Sajaci. They don't want to block him. If Scott's not going to win the job over Ciani, you probably don't have Scott on the roster. Now, if Scott does win the job, Ciani's a great fit for that outfield spot that we're kind of devoted to Koperniak right now off your bench. But if Ciani kind of holds them off, they want to get Victor more work in AAA, they want to get Sajaci more work in AAA, it's not a negative on Matt Koperniak to say he's not somebody that is projectable to an everyday big league starter. He might be able to come up and prove everybody wrong about that. But if the guy was 26 last year in AAA and still didn't get a look, that organizationally, and he turns 27 later this week, actually, before spring starts, kind of gives you an idea as to, hey, maybe he could just be the perfect big league bench bat. He had an 882 OPS last year and can be somebody that he's getting a big league debut, so he's not complaining about his playing time. The role might make sense for him to adjust to life as a big league bench guy, where the opportunities are obviously going to come because they eventually do for everybody on the roster, depending on injuries, depending on need, and there will be that proving ground for him. So I think it's actually a big spring for Matt Koperniak to be able to assert himself into the outfield mix and potentially grab onto one of those bench spots for the Cardinals. I think we're going to see a ton of Matt Koperniak in spring because when you think about the guys who have already made the roster, what happens? Well, they start, they take a couple of at-bats, and then they go hit the showers. The Koperniaks of the world, which was the case last year, I think, again, they're going to look at him pretty long and hard when it comes to spring, and he's going to get lots of ABs. And if he's able to kind of carve out the nice niche for himself, not surprising at all if he ends up making this roster. Again, Arenado, that's the impact. Whether he's here, and you say, okay, Arenado's your third baseman, Gorman, Donovan are splitting second base. You're trying to find a way to get Donovan some outfield at bats, but then you're pushing Walker as well to do that. It's better if Arenado's gone to be able to do everything else they want to do, because it doesn't just impact Gorman. It also impacts your catchers because of viability to be able to use that DH on somebody who isn't Gorman, because to get Gorman in the lineup, they might be DHing somebody. And then you're a little bit lesser on the playing time that you probably devote to Jordan Walker because you're trying to make sure Donovan's in your lineup every day. You're shifting Nootbaar to right, you're putting Donovan back and left, and it's very quickly a house of cards that comes tumbling down when it comes to how Arenado's presence impacts the Cardinals' legitimate ability to do the play the kids mantra. So I think that's what a lot of people are seeing around the game. That's what I think they see within St. Louis. We like Arenado, man. He's a great player. It just feels like with the direction they're going, if the Cardinals wanted to keep Arenado, and I see some people on YouTube in my comments say, no, keep Arenado. He's good at baseball, and I want the Cardinals to do well. And I agree with that. I think it's opportunity cost. What are you giving up by keeping Arenado? Do you go from a projected 79 win team to a projected 82 win team? I think that's fair to say. I think Arenado makes you better. But do you potentially lose out on the knowledge of we really know at the end of 2025 what Nolan Gorman is and if we're going to move forward with him or move on from him. That's what the Cardinals are trying to figure out. They're not going to move on from Jordan Walker, I wouldn't think, even with a down season here, but let's give him every opportunity to go, okay, what is he offensively at this point in his career? Can he be a viable outfielder? I think you need to see that regularly as well to be able to, beyond 2025, when the Cardinals do maybe prioritize contention on a higher plane than what they're doing right now, can a team that's contending or basically saying it has to contend, can that type of team afford to have Jordan Walker running around in the outfield, or is he a liability? You don't care about that this year. You can afford to find out. You give him every opportunity to learn and grow. That's the runway. That's the platform. It's not indefinite, though. And so you want to find that out. If he's losing games in the outfield because the Cardinals have to find somewhere to put Nolan Arenado, it's not what you want. And I'm not saying that would for sure happen, but you wouldn't have to squint too hard to see the way that would come to fruition. I laid it out a little bit. If Gorman can't play third, he's got to play somewhere. Well, maybe he DHs. Okay, if he's DHing, are you sacrificing Ivan Herrera then because the Cardinals like Pajez's defense? That's almost just as bad as sacrificing the time for Walker. Something would have to give. And it's nothing that the Cardinals should be in a position to want to give or sacrifice because they have an edict to play the younger players to find out what they are and allow guys to develop. That's the plan for this year. So let me know your thoughts on everything. Tried to lay out again how Arenado impacts it all and what the downstream effect would be of him staying. And sort of the interpersonal aspects of that too, I think are for sure interesting. So let me know, folks, what you guys think about this one. And we will continue breaking down all things Cardinals. I am planning to head to Jupiter next week. Let me know if you'd like to partner with the podcast to help send me there. It's a little bit tenuous. We're trying to thread this needle financially. But if we've got businesses that say, hey, I want to partner with B-Schaeff Daily, well, that's the easiest way to be able to make this trip happen. So thank you guys so much for your support, for listening, for sharing with your friends, for saying this is the Cardinal podcast that I like to listen to every day. And it's going to be more regularly every day now, especially with the season coming around the corner. And season 5 is coming up. I've always changed it. I don't even know if you guys see this on Spotify, but the way I log it internally, the seasons of the podcast, the very first podcast I do from Jupiter every year is considered a new season. So we've done 4 seasons. It'll be season 5 coming up next week. So thank you guys so much for being along for this ride. Subscribe on YouTube. Consider a YouTube membership. Check out the Discord. The link is on the profile for the YouTube channel. But if you need the link to Discord, hit me up. You guys know where I am on Twitter, @bschaefer12. Thank you guys so much, and we'll talk to you next time on B-Schaeff Daily. Peace.